This is Novara FM. Why does nothing in Britain work? Or at least that's how it feels. Broken Britain has been a rallying cry for the far left and far right for years now, with the latter arguably squeezing more political mileage out of it. Why is that? Well, attached to crumbling scaffolding that Britain is built on, like the NHS or potholed roads or delayed trains, are a load of subliminal narratives about what having access to these services, or their existence in the first place, means for us, as citizens, as individuals, and as people living in a country that used to rule over the rest of the world, don't you know? These are narratives of belonging and exclusion, of building a future for the collective versus building a bunker just for ourselves as the world falls apart. They're very powerful. And one man has written a must-read book all about them. Dr. Davies is a senior lecturer in English at City University in London, and he's also the author of The Broken Promise of Infrastructure. The title is one I fear that some people will switch off at, but please, bear with us, because we're about to dive into an episode that explains everything from why Maggie Thatcher is responsible for road rage to why politicians just can't help making pledges faster than they can break them. In this conversation, Dominic and I go from Stoke-on-Trent to Silicon Valley and back again, covering why the water in your taps makes you feel like you belong and how food banks could provide the sort of model for infrastructure that means we'll never need a food bank again. Let's get into it. Nothing Works has emerged as a rallying cry. Even the Conservatives were trying to position themselves as sort of fixers of the problems with the nation's infrastructure and public services, despite them being in power for 14 years presiding over those infrastructures and those services. When did this narrative of broken Britain first emerge?
That specific phrase, broken Britain, belongs to David Cameron. And it was his kind of way of mobilising people against New Labour in the run-up to the 2010 general election. And then kind of austerity kind of weakened. You know, there was such severe cuts so quickly that, you know, the basic services did start to feel. People, you know, politics for many people, I think, feels very abstract. It feels like the government, doesn't really matter who the government is. You know, it's just something that people in Westminster talk about, but actually doesn't actually have any bearing on your life. But I think in the last 14 years, that's become, politics has become incredibly immediate to people because the basic things, you know, the bus route that they used to rely on to get to, you know, their social club or whatever, the kind of train that they used to commute into London to go to work because they can't get a job anywhere else, is no longer running, or it's late, or it's always cancelled. You know, these kind of much more everyday routine, this feeling that Britain is broken has kind of obviously spiralled in the last sort of decade or so. And obviously austerity is a large part of that. But really, you know, since 2019, and I would say that, you know, we can maybe talk more about this, but the Brexit vote and the 2019 election were votes to address that feeling of brokenness. But then it's really in the early 2020s, in the wake of COVID, when, you know, you have polls. There's a poll in May 2023. It was like just there was a poll, like a huge poll, like thousands of people. And the most commonly used word to describe Britain was broken. So I think it kind of, it's maybe about 20 years old, but it's kind of suffused. And I mean, you know, even in the latest general election campaign, Sunak's being asked about broken promises and Britain being broken. You just see it on Question Time week after week. Now it's very much part of the sort of public consciousness, I think.
What do you think that consciousness where everyone's like, nothing works, everything's broken, what does that do to us in the first place? Where does that get us operating from?
Well, just on Nothing Works, by the way. I know it's not the most attractive title for this book. And I've been thinking, like, what would have been a better title? Maybe Nothing Works would have been quite a good one. And I know, like, Novara dubbed it the Nothing Works election, didn't you? Well, so this is, so I think Nothing Works is a good starting point. It's a feeling, right, that nothing works. The problem is, I think, is that it's what we're seeing. It's important to think of at least the post-war social contract, which we are living in the twilight of at the moment, which was the state, you sort of, working class stops agitating so hard, and, the ruling class will give you a few, give you some homes, and it'll give you some cars, and it will give you improved life expectancy from, for you and more importantly, your kids probably. That's the social contract that Britain's been operating on for the last 70 years. And the problem with the feeling of nothing works is that it's not just, this is how I put it in the book, it's not just the physical systems that are coming apart, it's a belief system. The real scary question is what happens, what fills that void. And the people who can afford to, subscribe to more and more privatized forms of infrastructure, right? And when we see this in places, in parts of the global south where, inequality is even more extreme. I think people also turn to, for various reasons, populist movements, right? So we might think of Corbyn, obviously, which was, if Corbyn's tenure was not about infrastructure, then it wasn't about anything, right? Those manifestos were all detailed infrastructure projects or programs. But they also turned to the far right, which has become very good at using a language of infrastructure without making any solid promises on infrastructure and blaming other people, basically.
Infrastructure, as we know, is a big, vague word that a lot of people's brains switch off when they hear. And that's kind of deliberate, isn't it? Because infrastructure used to be referred to as public works.
Yeah.
Why is that change in terminology so significant? And why the change in the way people thought about politics did it represent?
Yeah, so the word infrastructure is actually not that old. It kind of aligns with that social contract that I was talking about. It sort of comes into the Anglophone world. It's a French term originally, just a sort of mundane engineering term used in kind of boring journals by sort of engineering experts. They weren't boring to people writing them, I'm sure, but for most of us. And then, suddenly in the post-war period, it gets switched. It comes in, enters into English, and it becomes increasingly, if we track its usage through time, it starts to become used more and more, and public work starts to decline more and more. And I make a few arguments in the book about why this is the case. Number one being that what this is tracking is a shift from a world of empire or a world of competing empires, where colonial powers built public works, both at home and abroad, or imperial powers, I suppose, to a kind of national, a world where we're looking at competing nation states. And infrastructure is the thing that tracks economic growth. So, again, I know this infrastructure is boring. My favorite quotation, or one of my favorite quotations in the book is from Thatcher, obviously. And she says, she's giving a talk to a women's institute in the late 1980s. And she says, you and I may have traveled by road or rail, but economists travel by infrastructure. And so she's sort of saying that infrastructure describes the hard materials that we all use every day, but it also describes this larger phenomenon of economic growth. And obviously economic growth is how nations compete with one another. It's how wealth is distributed in the global economy. But infrastructure has this kind of symbolic life then. It tells us something on the spreadsheet as well as in the world. And I guess what I'm interested in is also the kind of the cultural life that it has beyond that. I don't know if I've started to answer your question there.
No, you did start to answer my question, and I will get you to continue to answer my question.
Yeah.
So you're is the argument essentially that infrastructure replaces public works as we start to move towards this neoliberal idea which focuses on growth as the measure of success?
Yeah, maybe another way to think about this is to think about imperial powers expanded their power. Empires expanded their power by expanding territorially in space. And then really kind of, with the inter-imperial rivalry at the beginning of the 20th century, space runs out. There's no colonial territories left. And then you have a wave of decolonial a wave of decolonization, anti-colonial uprisings, independence movements that are successful. And competition moves from territorial expansion to national growth, and infrastructure emerges to track that. Exactly, yeah. So, as you're kind of saying by juxtaposing it with public works. It's the shift from an idea of something that's a social good to something measuring this very, very narrow barometer of wealth that actually, if growth goes up in Britain, it doesn't really tell us how whether bus services are working in Stoke-on-Trent, does it? It tells us maybe the fortunes of the city on that particular quarter.
Yeah, Stoke-on-Trent actually comes up in the book a lot. Yeah. You start the book in Stoke-on-Trent. Why is Stoke such a great exemplar for you of your arguments around infrastructure?
Yeah, so big plug for Stoke. It's having a cultural renaissance at the moment. Definitely worth a visit. It's known locally as the Potteries for its historic ceramics industry. And that's definitely one of the reasons I'm interested in Stoke, because, that ceramics industry boomed in the 18th century and really led to the construction of a whole vast network of infrastructures that tied Stoke to a global economy, a global marketplace. Josiah Wedgwood, who's also a figure who features quite a lot in the book, was a kind of entrepreneur and a potter, and he very much innovated a way into this global marketplace, quite ruthlessly in some respects, didn't always treat his workers that well, but invested a lot of his profits in building infrastructure in Stoke and to connect Stoke to a global marketplace. So what I find particularly interesting about Stoke is that it has such a strong sense of place, such a strong local identity. People from the Potteries, so good-humoured and very cognizant of that cultural and industrial heritage. But it's fundamentally constituted through global flows. So another sort of phrase that I take from Doreen Massey, the feminist and Marxist geographer, and she talks about the global sense of place. So it seems really interesting to me that so much of the arguments that have been made around infrastructure recently are through the vehicle of the nation state and around a sort of ethno-nationalism. And yet here is Stoke with its infrastructures that are built from a global network to constitute a local sense of place. And I'm really interested in that internationalism and that localism. And Stoke provides that for me.
And I feel like we're now in a time where the arguments about the local are coming back. Like political parties are starting to once again say, like, we need to get hyper-local, even if they're not actually delivering on that. They're talking about the local. And people are like, well, why does, my local bus not work? Why do the trains not stop here? Why is the library being shut down? And I think this is a good point to get on to starting to talk about the emotional investments we have in things like trains, roads, libraries. So can you explain the concept of infrastructures of feeling, which is discussed in your book? I think that's the way we should start.
Yeah, it's a good place to start. So some of your listeners will probably recognise in that phrase, infrastructures of feeling, might recognise Raymond Williams's phrase, structures of feeling, which, as he says, is he coins it to describe, I guess, like ways of relating to the world, stories that we tell about the world, cultural narratives, a kind of social glue, if you like. Stories that we share in common, but that never quite cohere into specific ideologies or specific kind of really entrenched cultural narratives. They remain, he says, as hard as structure sounds and as ephemeral as feeling sounds. It's that kind of weird, ambivalence around that of kind of ephemeral, but at the same time really important. And so I take that same phrase, and other scholars have done it too, to develop this phrase, infrastructures of feeling, to kind of deepen the structure and say, right, okay, infrastructures are railways, roads, the concrete stuff that makes up our world. And yet we have all these kind of ephemeral stories floating around that we all kind of know and we all kind of attach to them, but no one ever really speaks about or identifies because no one ever packages them up and presents them to you. And that defines them as kind of structures of feeling, really. So in a way, I was kind of, with this phrase, infrastructures of feeling, I'm kind of following Raymond Williams in trying to identify the feelings and affects and stories that float around infrastructures, but that we've never quite identified. And I think it's really important to identify them because I think the case I make in the book is that they're being weaponized, particularly by right-wing politicians, and that, if you don't know what you're up against, it's much better to identify and understand where these stories come from, so that we can then begin to build our own.
Let's dig into one of those stories. So you talk about how infrastructure is a means through which citizens exercise their citizenship. Let's elaborate on that a little bit. Give me some examples.
The left likes to speak in very big, abstract terms because we're all academics. We talk about citizenship, and we talk about capitalism, we talk about profit, and we talk about exploitation. And we talk about racism, and it's really important to talk about all those things. But how are those things actually meted out? How are they experienced? How are they encountered on the ground? And your citizenship is your entitlement to, or certainly in the immediate post-war period anyway, it was your entitlement. You experienced your citizenship and you felt it through your right to social housing, right? Or your right to move across borders is another really interesting example. You could think of kind of the gates at Heathrow as a kind of border infrastructure, right? And your citizenship allows you to move through those easily. It allows you to, when you turn on your tap and clean potable water comes out, that is your citizenship right there, right? That's your kind of, you are entitled to a grid. Obviously, we all pay for it in different ways, but that's us buying into a collective idea, a shared idea of what infrastructure is. So it's a very felt, very immediate, very embodied thing. I give the case towards the end of the book. I talk about how racism, for example, is experienced through failing infrastructure. What is racism? It is the sort of stacked failures that led to the fire at Grenfell. Each one of those material infrastructure failures is racism materialized. So, the fact that the fire doors didn't work is a kind of instance of racism because they were not fixed because people didn't care about those people or didn't regard their lives as deserving. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. But I'm interested in how you also map this onto Brexit, for example, because you use these two narratives of infrastructure to talk about how people understood Brexit and what Brexit meant to them.
Yeah.
What are those two competing narratives?
Yeah, so I mean, the big sort of national infrastructure of feeling is about attached to growth. It's about movement. It's about autonomy. It's about a national kind of viz, as Johnson might describe it, a feeling of mobility, of movement, of a smooth road, right, without potholes, or an uninterrupted flow of water, right? So kind of flows and movement, a kind of ability to sort of get around in an uninterrupted way, and then. Sort of opposite that is the kind of, what I would call the infrastructural unconscious, if you like, of the nation state is the refugee camp, right? Where there's a sense of immobility, of stasis, of kind of permanent impermanence. So, if you are a citizen, you should be entitled to move around the country. And if you're a non-citizen, you're not entitled to those flows, right? Your non-citizenship is lived through infrastructure just as much as your citizenship is lived through infrastructure. And what we saw around Brexit, I point to two images in particular, if you like, that kind of sum up this feeling, this kind of weaponization of this infrastructure of feeling, which is the Boris bus, which I'm sure everyone will remember, which had the big promise for money on the side of the bus, and the money that would come back for the NHS. And in a very material way, that is literally, if that money comes back for the NHS, that is improving people's life expectancies and life chances because it will go into the NHS. But also, I think the bus itself is significant, right? Because it was like a national bus service, and it was like going to drive all around the country, and it was a symbol of mobility. It was promising voters that they would get back behind the wheel and take control of their own lives and be able to sort of move forward, right, into the future. That was promised. And then the kind of antithetical image was Nigel Farage's very famous Breaking Point poster, which, if people remember, showed kind of very sort of deliberately racialized, mostly male refugees on the edges of Europe, mostly arriving from Syria and parts of Iraq. And Farage presented this as a kind of, he said, he was kind of saying Britain's borders are broken. But what he was really saying was, look at the mobility that these non-citizens have and that has been denied to you. So not everyone, but, we're thinking, our buses are gone, our kind of mobility feels experientially less in Britain. Britain feels broken in this very material way. And yet there are all these people, all these non-citizens, undeserving non-citizens, who are moving into the country and have a kind of mobility that they don't deserve. So it really the Brexit vote really played on this, I would call it, a kind of infrastructural imaginary, or a kind of infrastructure of feeling about senses, ideas of deserving and non-deserving, citizenship and non-citizenship, specifically as they articulated through the lived experience of infrastructure.
Yeah, throughout this sort of electoral campaign as well, I spoke to voters, and in one area where there was very little immigration of the type that they were talking about, there's Eastern European immigration in the past, which has obviously had the kibosh put on it a little bit because of Brexit, but they all spoke about this boogeyman of immigration, and they referred to infrastructure being overwhelmed. They said there's no room, our services are broken, we don't have room for people. Like, how does that fit in with the paradigms you're describing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's not a coincidence, obviously, that the refugee crisis happened a year before Brexit. That was absolutely instrumental, with the Calais jungle, for instance, as being this hyper-visual space of ramshackle infrastructure, and war zones, images of Syria and destroyed Syrian cities circulating through the media. Literally people's infrastructure being precarious, being kind of obliterated. And now we're living through it again, aren't we, with Gaza? And there's a sense in which the more those images are held up, the more a kind of, refugees are kind of defined through their relationship with poor infrastructure. And so in order to sort of revitalize citizenship in a country where infrastructure is failing, those images become very important psychically, I would say, for the country, because they kind of express everyone's deepest fear, that kind of infrastructure is going to come apart, that our citizenship is going to become worthless, that what we might call the wages of whiteness too, that racial politics and racialized identity and whiteness becomes worthless too. And these are the pillars that our society is built on. So I can see why the figure of the migrant, and I think really we can't divorce that figure of the migrant from the infrastructural conditions, or the poor infrastructural conditions from which they emerge, has become such a kind of almost like a spectre in Britain today. Yeah.
Why do you think politicians are so keen, or at least prominent politicians in Britain are so keen to entwine nationalist and racist narratives with promises about infrastructure? Like, why is that so effective for them instead of just building something?
Yeah, I've been asked this question a few times, and also about like leveling up. What was the point in like spending a little bit to create infrastructures that looked like infrastructures but didn't actually do anything? And I think those two questions are the same, really. It's ultimately to avoid a meaningful redistribution of wealth, primarily to Britain's regions, which have been, in the limelight since Brexit, and places like Stoke, which turned out overwhelmingly for Brexit, and swung from Labour. All three seats swung from Labour to the Tories in 2019 for the first time in their history. So really, I think if you aren't going to rebuild the social contract and meaningfully redistribute wealth, which after 50 years of neoliberalism, there's literally nothing left to privatise. There's nothing left to kind of to hoard up, there's Britain's regions are literally coming apart infrastructurally. The only thing left really is to weaponise those little residual feelings that are left. That okay, the infrastructure is terrible here, but it's worse in that Syrian city that's been bombed to shreds, or it's worse in that refugee camp, or if you can't act out your citizenship through a reliable bus service, then you act it out by hyper visualizing or reassuring yourself that at least non-citizens have even worse infrastructure, right? And that's being a clear, whether it's consciously formulated or not, it's been a clear strategy of the right. And I include, when I say the right, I mean a sort of affected kind of liberal rights of like Boris Johnson towards a sort of more openly racist far right like Nigel Farage. Yeah.
We've talked about infrastructure as giving people mobility. We think of it as like, okay, I can take the train from my small parochial town to London and make a life for myself there. But you write about infrastructure in a really interesting way, because you talk about this amazing phrase, which is the freedom to stay put.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit for me?
I can. So this is probably like, I've been told this is a very melancholy book. I mean, the title, is The Broken Promise of Infrastructure. And it is about how Britain is breaking, and then all the lies we're being told to prevent us from mobilising to do something about it. So, yeah, obviously it is a little bit depressing, and Britain is depressed at the moment, economically, psychologically. So it reflects the place that it's about. But obviously I did want to try and find some hope and some seeds of hope, and also to offer perhaps a bigger conceptual orientation or a set of stories that we might begin to tell that perhaps not as evident, but they're perhaps sort of around and about in Britain, and that we can draw out a little more. And the kind of main concept around that is that if infrastructure, certainly for the last sort of 40, 50 years, infrastructure has been experienced as the promise of mobility, as the right to get in your car and drive off to your multiplex or whatever, or to get on a train and travel across the country. What would happen if we tried, or indeed the mobility for capital, that infrastructure is really just to move capital around and raise national growth rates, but not really do anything for the people who miss out on that growth? What would happen if we thought of infrastructure differently, as creating not a freedom of mobility, but a freedom? And it's an abolitionist term, freedom as a place. Ruth Wilson Gilmore uses this, the African-American geographer uses this phrase, freedom as a place. And so I sort of take that up and bring it into she's talking about California with its kinds of extremes of mass incarceration and, huge levels, unprecedented levels of car ownership. So much more kind of carceral and privatized landscape. But actually there are really powerful resonances, certainly in Britain's regions, of people literally imprisoned by a lack of infrastructure and by a carceral landscape, and an increasingly privatized infrastructures that promise mobility but nothing else. And it could be a familiar experience to so many listeners, I'm sure, who grew up in Britain's regions and ultimately felt they had to leave to get either to get an education or to get a job, and who would love to go back, but there's no work for them there. And when they do go back, it takes them hours to get around by bus or by train, and there's very sort of little cultural infrastructure there. So my kind of conceit, I suppose, was that you might think about, okay, what have we changed the way of thinking about, okay, we need forms of mobility and restoring the mobility that's been lost, and instead thought about what would you need not to have to move. And a place like Stoke, that would mean, okay, we'd have to have a mass house building program to start with, because it's sort of like a recent study showed that it was short of like 80,000 units. And the last Tory council built like 400 or something, So you would need a mass house building program. You need huge injections of cash into the NHS. You'd need proper funding for cultural institutions. Just rather than thinking about, okay, rather than building another road, that means, okay, well, why don't we build another road that allows people in Stoke to get to Manchester a bit more quickly? What about if you think about what would we need to allow people to live rich and meaningful lives? And I'm not saying people don't live rich and meaningful lives already in Stoke. They absolutely do. And there's astonishing resilience and cultural uplift ongoing at the moment. But thinking about infrastructure in that way could really benefit Britain, I think.
And another thing you pick up in the book is that instead of thinking about infrastructure in a way of like, what would it mean to stay put? There's this thing that happens, which is the spectacle of infrastructure, which is something like a pretty useless arena is set up in, say Stoke or, Wolverhampton or somewhere that won't really get a lot of footfall, and a politician comes and opens it and says, "Way, got this big arena." It doesn't do anything actually for the people living there. And also, as you say, moves capital out. It doesn't get reinvested. Yeah. But that spectacle of infrastructure is not just limited to the domestic, right? You talk about it it has this long history in our colonial project. So how would you say we've used infrastructure as a country in places like Africa and India?
Yeah, so this is really important because we've talked a bit already about the racialization of infrastructure, I suppose, and the idea that certain ideas about whiteness are attached to functioning infrastructure, and that sort of racialized populations are sort of part of the racialization is their attachment to, or their kind of conflation with, forms of malfunctioning infrastructure. And that is not just, as you say, that's not just a contemporary phenomenon. And in fact, the reason that it has those racialized elements is because infrastructure grows out of the empire. I mean, the very first kind of research that I started doing into infrastructure was about this question. In Britain, we have this kind of nostalgia for the railways. If you ask someone like, what did the empire do that was good? People immediately say, reliably, and it's almost a cliche now. Maybe people don't say it anymore because it's a bit too stereotypical, but certainly when I was growing up, people said, the railways are evidence that at least elements of the British Empire were benevolent. And then I went to all these colonial archives and I looked at all these maps, and they're quite clearly built between coastal ports and coal mines or diamond mines or gold mines. They're quite clearly not built for any sort of benevolence. So there's a real disjunct there between the kind of economic reality of infrastructure as a method of extraction and the idea that we all have that infrastructure is this kind of great benevolent act of kind of development and uplift and I guess forms of growth. And this is a technique honed in the colonies, right? It's absolutely, in a way, it's kind of, a great person to talk about here is Frantz Fanon, who will be known to anyone who's ever written about infrastructure. His book, The Wretched...
Or
imperialism, exactly, or decolonization. But who, opens his famous treatise, Wretched of the Earth, with this description of the colonial city as the white city, as this spectacle of smooth roads, gleaming electric lights, overflowing trash cans that are cleaned away by invisible labor, and this is the spectacle of infrastructure, right? It's this kind of projection of, to put it bluntly, projection of white supremacy, absolutely. And so the reason, the most important reason that we in Britain particularly, that we encounter and imagine infrastructure through racialized imaginaries is because of that history of empire, that kind of boomeranging back of the infrastructure that we built in the empire, or that Britain built across its empire back into the UK and the imaginaries that were attached to it.
You also pull that sort of like infrastructure spectacle into modernity, because you write about Blair and the war on terror. How does the spectacle of infrastructure play into what Tony Blair was doing?
Yeah, well, again, so I started researching infrastructure and the kind of cultural afterlives of infrastructure and in infrastructure across Britain's empire. I was doing that research in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and I came of age politically with the Iraq War and 9/11 and the whole war on terror. And it was only really later I was like, why did I become? You asked me at the beginning, why did I become so interested in infrastructure? And it's I think partly because, well, I was always a sort of anti-imperialist first. I only really became interested in British national politics much later with Corbyn and that kind of politicization. But I was always interested in anti-colonial forms of resistance and imperial history because of Blair's kind of the parallels, this astonishing parallels between the use of infrastructure at the height of the British Empire at the end of the 19th century, and Blair's kind of use of infrastructure, his kind of weaponization of the spectacle of infrastructure at the beginning of the 21st century. He talked about the infrastructures of democracy that we were going to build in Iraq, and in his biography, he mentions infrastructure maybe like 40 times, but there's only like 10 of those are to do with Britain's actual infrastructure. They're all projects abroad. Infrastructure is this kind of thing that Britain goes out and does to the rest of the world. And it's seen as this kind of benevolent thing, even when he's talking about destroying Iraq's, terrorist infrastructure as he talks about it. So it's really important, I think, to understand that we are inheriting so many ideas and imaginaries about that were attached to infrastructure through the kind of really kind of arch-imperial period, I would say, when Britain was at its height at the late 19th century, early 20th, and how these are mediating the ways that we talk about infrastructure and the way that we feel about infrastructure in the UK today and abroad. Yeah.
You talked about sort of community resistance there briefly. What are some examples of community resistance to failing infrastructure? And how are these movements creating alternative visions of what infrastructure can be or can do?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that I look for a lot in the book. And there are actually increasingly, even I think in the 4 years that I have been writing this book, there are more and more examples. But I'll give an example of one that I was involved with, and it's one that I give in the book, and it's not a sort of straightforward one. And it's an example of the food bank. So, I do not want to sort of be seen as celebrating food banks. I'm absolutely not. They're clearly a blight on the UK. Clearly, any sort of worthwhile politics should be about creating the conditions for their abolition. That should be the horizon we're moving towards. But what's interesting to me is that if you see food banks as a kind of community coming together to basically say, listen, the basic infrastructures of survival, of getting enough food to eat, have come apart. So we're going to fill in where the state has failed. That to me is, and it is a huge infrastructural effort, right? Food is brought in like vans. It's mass. You have huge hallways of kind of food being organized, and then it gets loaded into deliveries, and that's taken out to people who may suffer from disabilities or may suffer from limited mobility or just not be able to leave their homes. That to me is a kind of, what is that if it's not infrastructural? You're literally creating a future life where it had been eviscerated. And there was something about that experience for me participating as well in a kind of community infrastructure project, as I would call it, that changed the way I felt about infrastructure. I think if in electoral politics, it's all about the politicians trying to sell us something, and we're going to buy it with our vote, and who's going to get us the best deal, right? Around Brexit, it was literally who will get us the best deal. But, you see Starmer doing it now. It's all about, I won't waste your money on this and so on and so forth. But it changed. And so, we think of infrastructure as this, like, who's going to give us the best infrastructure? And it's this very alienating thing. It's something that happens to you. You have no control over it. Maybe there's like one citizen assembly, and then, the council builds a car park anyway, and it doesn't, it doesn't do anything for your community. So becoming part of the provision of infrastructure, I found that like very empowering and changed the way I thought about what infrastructure could be. And again, I don't want to kind of idolize the food bank, but there are loads of other great examples. We might think of like community energy projects. So people coming together to put solar panels on roofs, on community centres, people taking over, we were talking earlier about people taking over abandoned pubs and turning them into kind of cultural centres. There is a kind of a resurgent, maybe DIY kind of activism that we haven't seen since, I think, the early 1990s, really, with kind of Reclaim the Streets movements and things like that. it's being articulated differently now, but I think it's a really sort of promising. Well, it's something that the left should pick up on, because in a game of electoral politics, we're never going to, a progressive left is never going to beat the right on a convincing argument of deal or no deal, right? You have to reach people through their lived experience. And if infrastructure and the provision of infrastructure is part of that lived experience, then that creates a sort of common sense around a meaningful infrastructure program.
Yeah, I'm torn between immediately asking about deliverology and pledges, which I really want to do, and then also how the left can harness these infrastructure feeling, because you've given me two options there, which road to go on first. And then I also came up with the phrase "nothing works, but the public works."
Oh, nice!
Which I feel
I like that.
We have to use in a campaign immediately. Okay, I'm going to go with, first of all, let's talk about how the left could maybe harness infrastructure as a feeling. So we haven't done this as very well yet, but what you're talking about is so moving and so motivating when you hear it, and empowering. It's like, why have we not been able to, take back some of these narratives and repackage them and say, this is what infrastructure looks like for you? And what could that look like? I'm thinking about maybe the Green New Deal. That has been a good way to sell sort of infrastructure projects to the public.
Yeah, again though, Green New Deal, I mean, obviously I'm on board with the idea of the global Green New Deal. But it is still a deal, isn't it? It's still being articulated in the language of capital, I would say. I mean, I wouldn't be the first person to say that, you get a left government when people are unionized and they're engaged in collective forms of solidarity and empowerment, and then that maps onto a sort of an insurgent political party. But I think, maybe that's kind of what I was trying to do in the book, was to join. Even the Green New Deal sounds to me like quite an abstract language. It's this big package. No one knows how it's actually going to be implemented. I mean, maybe there are a few engineering experts and economists who do, but your average voter isn't. It's going to sound very, very alienating and abstract, without sort of falling into a insular localism, articulating it through a kind of, your life will improve because you will be able to, the traffic will be less on your streets, the air will be less filled with pollution, your buses will run regularly and reliably and they'll be electric, and your children will be able to be part of a sort of cultural community that's kind of thriving on a sort of, restored cultural infrastructure. Do you know what I mean? Like, kind of, how is the Green New Deal lived? I think is really important.
I totally know what you mean, but what is the difference between that and the pledgeocracy? So is there a difference between what you're saying and delivering and the pledges that I want to get onto very badly? Because let's get into pledgeocracy, actually, because that was one of the bits that I've been repeating ad nauseum to everyone around me. Politicians now love to make endless pledges. You spoke about it with Starmer, but it's like specific, 10 pledges, 6 pledges, 5 pledges, and they're specific individual promises, like stop the boats, get Brexit done, 20,000 more police officers. And in the book, you call this deliverology. When did this start? And what does it say about the changing relationship between, the individual and politicians?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not my term, deliverology. It's, it's Blair's and his deliverologist department, if you like. It really comes about with New Labour because, it distilled the kinds of what we're talking about is a kind of retraction of politics from something that's lived through the infrastructures that we engage with, through the communities we're a part of, to this very narrow, almost like professionalization of politics, right? But to this sort of a set of chits that we turn in once every 5 years or whatever. And in exchange, our local council might get a little bit more money. And this is kind of part of neoliberalism's economization of politics, right? Of turning everything into a deal. But I think Blair, is the kind of person who leads on this with his very famous pledge cards, where he literally took the manifesto and he shrunk the manifesto is the form of the promise, right? This is the promise of what the party will do. And he shrank the manifesto down to a business card with 5 pledges on it. I mean, the kind of introduction of a kind of neoliberal rationality into politics doesn't get more kind of evident than in that kind of in that pledge card. But ultimately, it's because politicians want to be seen to keep their promises, and we're living what we're going through now in the current general election campaign with Starmer and Sunak. Is Starmer is obsessed with not making promises that he doesn't keep. And that seems to be the only way that he can't, because if the Tories break promises, it's like, oh yeah, well, they're all politicians, they're all, Tories anyway, we always knew they were going to do that. But if Labour break promises, it's seen as a much bigger betrayal in some ways, I think.
He's broken all of his already.
He's broken them all already, yeah. Well, he's pivoting, isn't he? Because he's pivoting to a kind of public discourse. But yeah, I mean, absolutely, he's already broken his promises. But he's articulating a very clear set of, isolated promises, as you say, not part of a bigger agenda or vision. And he's taking a lot of criticism for that. But he must, like Blair before him, he must believe that it's better to make pledges that you can keep, or be seen to keep anyway, shall we say, be seen to have kept, than to break them, which obviously sort of retracts politics into this. We are living with the consequences of Thatcher's vision, if you like, because she was so good at changing our relationship with infrastructure through right to buy, through mass road building programs. She turned the experience of infrastructure from a collective one into an individualist one, and that we are still living with the consequences of that.
That's led me on to a treat question, which I have to ask just for myself, because there's an amazing bit in this book about road rage and Margaret Thatcher. Why is road rage linked to Margaret Thatcher in your eyes?
In my eyes, yeah. Well, I am fascinated by it, by the anger at people like Just Stop Oil or Insulate Britain when they block the M25. That, that's a proper violence. But then also, I mean, if you're a cyclist, you'll know that if you get in the way of someone in a car, you can very quickly become the victim of someone's anger. And it's a completely unhinged, affective response, because you're kind of distanced from the world, I guess. It's to do with kind of not the world outside seeming kind of not entirely real, more like a game or a simulation or something. But I think people get particularly upset when roads are blocked because they realise, that the idea of, or the promise of Thatcher's promise was that you could be in control of your own life. You can get in the car and drive away. You can own your own house. And obviously that's a lie, because obviously you need the council to maintain your roads if you're going to drive your car off. And if someone blocks that road, you suddenly realise that actually you're reliant on a huge global infrastructure that brings oil and fossil fuels and petrol from extraction zones into the country. You're reliant on road building. You're reliant on, so that fiction of individual control suddenly, like a rock falling out of the sky, you realise, actually, my mobility is entirely contingent on a vast system that I could never hope to control.
Yeah, like your privatised infrastructure, your individual infrastructure that you thought you had just for yourself, is actually just completely broken unless it's enmeshed with everything that's already existing in the collective. You talked about like politicians trying to be realistic. They would say there's no money left for any more infrastructure, and the kind of infrastructure we've been talking about that would be needed to allow people to stay put, to allow a different future. Is it realistic to expect investment in British infrastructure without either compromising other services or turning to private backers?
So I think, I'm not an economist, but kind of one of the key arguments I make in the book is that we could design our infrastructure a little bit better, right? You can build infrastructure in a way that keeps, and it's kind of connected to the idea of freedom as a place, right? So at the moment we build infrastructure. For example, I begin the book with a development in Stoke with a big car park, and a sort of arena or a stadium for visiting short tour shows that was going to be owned by a private company. Well, the car park is there to bring people from the outside because it's sort of assumed that there's no wealth in Stoke, and so the only way to get middle class people from places like Cheshire or other parts of Staffordshire to come in and spend their money in their cars, because God forbid they should have to get on some public transport. And then it's there might be a few jobs in that arena, but it's going to be owned by a private corporation that's going to whip all that profit away and take it to its shareholders. So I'm kind of very interested in how you could build an infrastructure that cycled capital back into the place that made it. And Preston is the great example here. That great book, Paint Your Town Red, about Preston and community wealth building. Where kind of prioritizing local businesses, all the money that you spend ends up somewhere. So can you make sure it ends up back in the place that you're trying to rebuild? So that more cyclical vision of place-based infrastructure provision. And I think there will be really important cultural and affective, there will be feelings that come from that will absolutely serve a more progressive national government, if that makes sense.
Of course it makes sense.
Yeah.
Of course it makes total sense to me. The other flip side of that idea about private investment and the constant, arguments that we need private investment in our infrastructure to make it happen is also about private individuals. So you write about the Pottery King, Josiah Wedgwood, and then later you talk about Elon Musk. Now Wedgwood built towns, he turned Stoke-on-Trent, at least the narrative goes, into like this thriving urban industrial town. Musk in the present is supposedly taking us to Mars. But what's the truth of the relationship these different men have to infrastructure and getting stuff built?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a really important story that I try to tell, and it's part of the infrastructure feeling that I call origins. So where does infrastructure originate? When you arrive in Stoke, and I should say I grew up in Stoke. I
think people have guessed.
Okay, yeah. I feel like people are like, why is he banging on about Stoke so much? Because I grew up in Stoke and I know Stoke very well. And as you exit the train station, at least for the time being, they're talking about moving it. But there is a statue of Josiah Wedgwood, who, the statue credits him implicitly with putting Stoke on the map. And he built a whole new factory town called Etruria. He invested the capital and commissioned loads of the canals that connected Stoke to places like Liverpool, so ceramics could be exported. He brought a lot of growth to Stoke. And so the statue is kind of symbolic, really, of it kind of credits him with the origins of Stoke and with the origins of the infrastructure that made Stoke. And I guess like what I'm trying to say is like, in the book, it's like, well, how could we tell a different story of origins that might more accurately reflect where that wealth comes from? And, if you look at Edward Colston, for example, in Bristol, who laundered his slave money by building infrastructure all over Bristol, almshouses, hospitals, streets, ports, and is credited, or was, until 2020, was credited with the authorship of Bristol in many ways. He's like, that statue reminds people that he put Bristol on the map. And when people tore that down, they said, no, that isn't where the wealth comes from. It comes from the slave labor from your colonies in the Caribbean. And so I don't necessarily say we should tear down the statue of Josiah Wedgwood. Wedgwood was an abolitionist, much more progressive in his own ways, certainly treated his workers much better. At the same time, it's really important to understand that boom of wealth came from, absolutely has its origins in Britain's connections with the slave trade. The sort of surplus capital that was made possible by huge profits from slavery and from production of sugar and tea were used to build the canals. And then everyone's drinking tea. I mean, I use that. Stuart Hall has the great phrase, the outside history inside the history of the English is betrayed by the cup of tea. The most quintessential thing has sugar and tea in it, which shows that Englishness is a global phenomenon. Yeah. And then, Wedgwood made his money on teacups, right? On china sets, on porcelain. And so, he was profiting from, I'm not saying he wasn't a genius and didn't innovate his way into that marketplace, but he was still his wealth and the infrastructure that he built in Stoke was still contingent on a global system of circulating wealth that was ending up in Britain. And when we start to tell a more honest story about where the wealth that Stoke once enjoyed came from and the other parts of Britain once enjoyed came from, then we can start to actually do something about it, right? Because if we think that it's just geniuses who innovate their way into a marketplace and create, very much in the way that Elon Musk presents himself and the way that Josiah Wedgwood is remembered, then it's like, okay, well, cut taxes, deregulate, give these people as much space as possible. But obviously they can't do that if there isn't capital floating around and there aren't kind of planning strategies and wealth of the kind that Britain will never enjoy because it doesn't have an empire anymore. So in fact, we have to think about where is the wealth that we do have originating? How can we redistribute that in a way that it stays in places in Britain and create a kind of cycle or a circuit, I suppose, that builds community wealth rather than sees it zipping off to other parts of the world.
Well, yeah, it's like Amazon warehouses setting up, and all the wealth from that is just beeped straight out of the country.
Beeped straight out of the country.
And as you point out, they're using the British infrastructure to make those profits in the first place.
Yeah, that Amazon doesn't contribute anything to all the roads on your streets and everything that they're using for wear and tear. Neither does Uber. And I think also the damage that something like Amazon does to a sense of place. Those anonymous dystopian warehouses attached to one another by dual carriageways where you can't walk. There's no sense of heritage, of cultural identity. You can't belong in a place like that, And so no wonder people feel so disenfranchised and pissed off about the whole thing, basically. So, yeah.
So is this... It does feel like this is a really rich place for people on the left to, start refocusing their efforts because the nothing works narrative is one that has cut through at all levels. And at the moment, it's being really weaponized, as you say, by the far right or the so-called liberal right to push these narratives of, racism and ethno-nationalism while meanwhile doing nothing about it. Yeah. So is this somewhere where the left needs to relook and actually start on the ground, trying to come up with these solutions of circular reinvestment and creating that infrastructure that will give people a sense of place where they are?
It's absolutely. What the left needs to do. I don't want to prescribe. It's not my expertise, and I don't know what I want to prescribe. But I do think we can look for stories around that, around different forms of belonging. I don't want to sort of fetishize community as such, but creating a kind of, if you like, a kind of infrastructure for a different politics, if you like, if that makes sense. What
are the key infrastructures of feeling you would advise the left to start pulling on?
Well, I really like your nothing works but the public works. But I think a little bit more honesty, really. A kind of a sense that Britain can't be fixed by a professionalised class of politicians, and it's not going to be. But at the same time, it is coming apart, and it's only going to get worse. And I think finding ways to be involved in some form of infrastructure provision is a really great way of doing this. I might just give an example of May from Stoke. Little plug for the Portland Inn project and their close associates, Drop City Books, which is a kind of a bookshop and a kind of community organisation. Portland Inn Project are a community organisation that have taken over a disused pub. They've put solar panels on the roof, and they've really created a place for people to come and spend time. And they do things like gardening and cooking and really basic kind of skills of, producing the stuff that we need to live, basically. Obviously, there are limits to how much communities can provide their own infrastructure. We absolutely do need a dynamic state that is going to invest in green forms of energy and, plan out at the national level and, nationalize energy grids and railway services and so on. But a more empowered community, a community that isn't sort of oh, well, infrastructure is this thing that either does or doesn't happen. A community that's like, oh, well, I'm involved in this project where we made solar panels. They're going to feel much more entitled and able to make demands for the kinds of infrastructure that are needed from local and national government. So I think it's a kind of ground-up enterprise, but it needs to operate from both sides and meet somewhere in the middle. But I think getting over this kind of feeling of alienation that we have, that infrastructure, because none of us know how. Not none of us, but most of us don't know how railways work. That, therefore we have no say over it, or we have no, it's not difficult to get into some of these cultural narratives and to start to tell different stories and to empower yourself to, and empower your communities to feel like you can make stronger demands on local government.
Dr. Dominic Davies, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support.